So it's Mother's Day, but you are not getting a Mother's Day sermon. I was assigned a passage, and I don't know who assigned the passages, but I don't like it. And I'm not sure that anybody at the end of this message is going to say, I really like that message today. So I'm just prefacing that before we start. We're going to look at Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. It says, "Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against that authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers do not hold terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoers. Therefore it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of a possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. This is why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor." In our study of Romans, we've heard over and over again that this passage in Romans, this book is written to believers. And I don't think we can get away from that. So if you're saying these verses don't belong to you, you're going to be wrong. So this applies very clearly to us today. It was written to believers. The word here, it says, be subject to. The word subject in Greece is hypotasso. It means to be subordinate or to submit to someone. And Greek is very specific. It's written in a grammatical term that's an imperative, so it's a commandment. So we are commanded here to submit or be subordinate to governing bodies. Governing bodies in Greek is hyperecho, and it simply means anyone who has authority over you. And it literally means someone who is superior in position or rank. If you're looking for an out in these verses, maybe you can say that, well, as spiritual people, the only authority we have is God, and therefore we are to submit to his authority, and all is good. But by the context of these verses, it would be a very bad translation, and you can't get away from that. This word for governing bodies is used 98 times in the Bible, and almost always translated as government. And so God is telling us here that we need to submit to the authority of the government. It says it really means anybody in authority, so you also have the idea of submitting to people that you're under authority of. It could be parents when we were children, it could be bosses at work, it could be elders in the church, but there's this idea that we need to submit to governing authorities. And then it says, no one gets into authority or gets into government without being established by God. Now, this is a hard statement that I don't like. It's saying that there's nobody in authority that God hasn't put there. If you really want me to get wound up, we can talk about Trump. And I thought, let me look to the south. And clearly God would not put a godless Democrat like Kamala Harris into power. He put someone like Trump who's, promoting Christianity. But that would also mean, how do you deal with Obama and Biden and all the other people that were in power down there? I thought, well, let's look closer to home. What about Trudeau or Carney or Ford? Has God put them in power, and how should we treat them? this is not very palatable to me, that, that God has arranged these things and put them in power, and we should be submissive to them. And it creates a moral dilemma for me. What about if the person in power abuses that power? Someone like Hitler, are we to obey him or not to obey him? There's some difficult questions you have to ask here. And the simple principle is that not all governments will rule with the principles that God wants them to rule with. And there's this idea here that governments are put in power sometimes to punish. There's this idea of suffering or wrath that comes with if you break the laws of the government. And I was wondering, in this sort of Hitler thing, is somehow, does that also apply to a nation? Was the German nation being punished because of their anti-Semitism? Their German nationalists, so some of the policies, were they being punished because of that? And was Hitler becoming an instrument of punishment to that? That's sort of outside of everything else. He's speaking here to a Jewish audience, and they had been overrun by the Romans. Jews were a proud people. They knew that they were the children of God. They were the chosen ones. And they had been conquered by this Roman war machine, and they didn't like it. They wanted freedom, and that's the context of what you're looking at. They hated the Romans, and they hated Jews who were involved with the Romans. It says, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God, and consequently, whoever rebels against that authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgments on themselves. This here is a very practical instruction. It's speaking to what is happening at the time. The Jews didn't want to pay taxes. We don't want to pay taxes. But they had been overrun by the Romans. They didn't like it. And Paul is saying here, no, you have to obey the government that you have been given, and you have to pay your taxes, and he goes on to say some other things. In 66 AD, there was a war between the Jews and the Romans. We don't often hear about these. There were several that happened in the first century, but the big one was in 66 AD, and thousands of Romans were killed by the Jews. This was probably written about 56 AD. All of that sentiment, all of that anger in people like Barabbas, who was a murderer and an insurrectionist, he wanted to overthrow the Roman government. So that was all percolating at the time that Paul is writing this letter to the Romans, and he's saying, I know what you want to do, but you need to obey God. Verses 3 and 4 say, if you're not breaking the law, you got nothing to worry about. If I follow the speed limit, I don't have to worry about police officers on the road. I used to always have excuses of why I drove so fast. I was busy, time was important, I had to be someplace, I was always going somewhere. I needed to make up that extra time when traffic was slow. I always had a reason why speeding was okay. A few years ago, we were living in Shalom Way. I'm coming to church in the morning down Mapleview, and I get pulled over by the police. 60 kilometers an hour, I'm doing 84. Guy comes to my window and he says, hey, you didn't even slow down when you saw me. I didn't say anything, but I thought in my mind, if I had seen you, I would have slowed down. And then all I could think was, don't ask me where I'm going. I don't want to tell him I'm on my way to church. That's a bad testimony. And so fortunately, he didn't ask me. And so, I came in. You read these verses, and it doesn't give you a lot of leeway. It tells you to obey the laws of the government. It tells you to not speed. So the other day I was driving to the cottage and I thought, I'm going to set cruise control at 105. The speed limits goes between 100 and 110 on the 400 going north. And so I thought, 105, can't be breaking any laws, I'll be good. I got to the cottage and I looked at my gas gauge and I went, man, this truck gets way better gas mileage at 105 than 125. And so there was, I think, a very simple lesson there. If you obey the laws, it also has some extra benefits. The next verse says, therefore it is necessary to submit to authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. It says it's necessary, and that word means to expose an external condition on things. So we obey sometimes because there's this external condition that causes us to obey. My cousin and I, when we were teenagers, we were hunting in this old gold mine site, and we walked out into this opening with a bunch of rocks, and there was 2 little bear cubs playing in the field there. And I stopped my cousin, and I said, don't make any noise, don't make any sudden movements, just back up very slowly, and we'll go back to our vehicle. And so we backed up, didn't make any noise. Our normal inclination was, if we saw something in the wild, we would catch it and take it home. Raccoons, skunks, porcupines, groundhogs, all have been captured and taken home to our house. But the external consequences of playing around with a baby bear when there's a mother bear around are quite disastrous. And I knew that. And I knew that if I tried to capture one of these little bears, we would probably get killed. Mother bears in the wild, when you upset their children, it's a very, very dangerous thing. So we very gently, very quietly backed out of that situation. Just a reminder that it's the external situation, the external circumstances that sometimes force us to obey. We call that in the law a deterrent, that laws are there to deter us from doing things wrong. You get caught for speeding, you pay a fine. You get caught too many times, people won't insure you, they take your license. That's a big deterrent. I was asked one time at work, how do we deter people from stealing from our company? We had a lot of inventory and we had a lot of cash that floated around. And I said to them, it's our responsibility as management is to put these things in place to make sure there's some sort of consequence. The idea that there should be a deterrent there from people if they know they're going to get caught, they're not going to steal from us. I had this guy who worked for me, and he was on customer service, and every couple of weeks, $30 or $40 would go missing from the cash. And I knew he was stealing. He had 4 ex-wives, he had multiple children, he had gone over to Thailand and bought a wife, and she had 3 kids, and so he was always short of money, but I could never catch him at it. So I bought a locking cash box, and I installed it, put all the cash in there, and I handed him the key. And I said, when you leave customer service, lock the box and take the key with you. And I said, you're the only one that has the key, you're the only one responsible for the cash. And I said, if cash goes missing again, I know who I'm going to come looking for. Never missed cash out of the till after that. So it answered my question and it stopped the problem. Paul takes us one step further. He says, we obey not just because we might get punished, we obey because our conscience tells us something is wrong. As believers, we have an internal moral compass that tells us right from wrong. We know whether something is right from wrong. I met a young person a few years ago who is a psychopath, has no ability to feel emotion. Just doesn't. But as a believer, has a moral compass that allows them to know right from wrong. Many psychopaths don't have a moral compass, and that's a very dangerous thing. And it would be very dangerous if they didn't, but they do. We have this moral compass, this conscience inside of us, the Spirit of God inside of us that tells us right from wrong. We just need to listen to it, that's all. It says, this is why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. I don't like this. I don't like that statement. Pay taxes. I don't like paying taxes. We were up north at Easter time, and my brother-in-law sit down in his living room. He says, Rob, should we be paying taxes to the government? They waste our money all the time, and we shouldn't pay taxes anymore. Where's this coming from? And so he shows me a video on his phone, and it's a preacher in Canada who's saying, no longer pay taxes. You have no moral obligation, no legal obligation as a believer in Canada to pay taxes anymore. And in this video, he says, governments are corrupt, they don't use the money wisely, and as Canadians, we don't have to pay taxes, and there are no consequences to that. And I'm thinking, you don't understand what you're saying, and you're just going to get a lot of people into trouble. So he hands me his phone. He says, watch this video. And the video starts off by saying, this is how much the government of Canada spends on education. Look how terrible our education system is. We're like 15th or 16th in the world. We spend billions of dollars on educating our children, and they're not educated well. Look how terrible Canada is. And I stopped the video at that point, because I know Canada always scores very well on international educational standards. And so I look it up. We're currently 4th in the world, and in some subjects, we're as high as number 2 in the world. And so Canada has a very high education standard in the world. And when someone lies about something in the very start of the video, I'm not going to waste my time watching the rest of it. And the weirdness of the internet, I watched this video on his phone, but in my feeds on my phone, this guy pops up now all the time. And so it's just a weird thing. And I don't watch his videos because he just drives me crazy. And if you think, like he's telling people, don't pay your taxes, you'll be fine. Government of Canada never puts people in jail, which is not true. And so, he's going to get people in trouble. And I'm wondering why a reasonably intelligent person, like my brother-in-law, would even listen to that stuff and want to believe that stuff, and why they go in that direction. In Matthew 21, we have the other passage which talks about paying taxes, and I'm going to read this. It says, then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words, and they sent their disciples to him, along with Herodians. And, teacher, they said, we know that you are a man of integrity, that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You weren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right that we should pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, says, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius, and they asked them, whose image is this, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When they heard this, they were amazed, so they left him and they went away. Now, I've had people use this passage to say, well, that's clear. Caesar's what is Caesar's, and the church belongs to, we belong to God. And I was thinking about that, probably the wrong way to phrase it. Does this church building belong to God or to man? Does it belong to Caesar, or is it God? Well, it's just a building. And we can have this debate if somebody wants it later. I don't even think we're going to get into heaven with the clothes on our back. There's nothing mortal that's going to exist in heaven. When we get there, it will be eternal. And we know that the only thing that we have here on earth that's eternal is human beings. I believe here that God is saying, give the government those things that are physical, mortal things, and give me the only things I care about, and those are those things that are internal, and that is human beings. When does civil disobedience come into play? When does disobeying the government the right thing to do? 30 years ago, I was working up north with a guy, and he was very involved in anti-abortion protesting. And he wanted me to come down to the Morgan-Tyler Clinic and protest. I was all in. I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to support that. I wanted to go down and be a protester because I thought it was the right thing to do as a believer. But then he said, well, you know that they have this restriction. You can't go within 100 feet or whatever the number was from the building. And he said, but we don't obey that. You know, if we can get up close and we can talk to somebody, we do that. And if we get arrested, so be it. And I thought, it didn't take very long to go from that to, in many places in the States, where they were shooting doctors and they were bombing clinics. And I think there's civil disobedience that is honoring to God, but if the government says you can talk to anybody you want but 100 feet away from the building, that is not an unreasonable restriction by the government, and we need to listen to this. Obviously, the one is during Second World War and what the Germans were doing, and I think it was right for Christians to house Jews and to keep people safe. The Catholic Church, the Pope issued a decree at the beginning of the war saying that the Germans were correct and we should obey them. And I think that was a great disservice to the Catholic Church. There was a small group of brethren churches over by the Swiss border in France, and they saved thousands of children and young people. And so as the Germans would issue an edict, you know, we need 10,000 Jews to fill up this train, they would go into hiding, and these assemblies would take them in and create false IDs for them and travel them across the country and get them across the Swiss border. Once they stood on Swiss soil, the Swiss government was waiting for them and would pick them up and take them to safety and take care of them. But they had to be able to get their feet on Swiss soil. The Swiss wouldn't come and get them. And I just thought, I read this book about this, and I thought it was incredibly fascinating and encouraging that this group of believers saved thousands and thousands of people during that Second World War. And I just thought that was very encouraging. What we can draw for this is fairly simple, is we should pay our taxes. The obedience to the basic laws of our governments is our Christian duty. I wish it said we didn't have to pay taxes. I would love it if it said we didn't have to pay taxes, but that's not what it says. I remember taking my very first tax course at university. Went down to the library to buy the book for the course. There were 6 or 7 different professors teaching tax at the time, different courses, and my professor was named Stan Lakin. And when I picked up the book that I had to buy, it was written by Stan Lakin. So I had the guy in my professor who had written the book for all the other professors. So I go to the class, and there's this very nerdy, booky guy standing there, and he opens his briefcase, back when people had briefcases, and he puts a T-shirt on. It says, "Trust Uncle Stan" across the front. And he goes into this little carny act about how, you know, I will save you more than the cost of the course the first time you do your tax return. He was a brilliant, funny man. He could barely see, and he would always check his watch like this. So he had to get his watch right in front of his nose in order to see it. Just one of the weird things I remember. But he would tell us, you can push the law all you want. You can find any loophole as long as it's legal. But if you break the law, you're going to be in trouble. And he would give us lots of stories about people he knew, very famous people, who went to jail because they broke the law when it came to income tax. Harold Ballards, who many of you will know, used to own the Toronto Maple Leafs, very famous case. Harold was building Maple Leaf Gardens, and he built a house, and he put all the money for his pool and everything else that he built through the corporation, even though it went into his personal pocket. And they caught him, and he went to Millhaven, and he made license plates. And Stan Lakin would tell us, do not break the law, because you'll be making license plates with my pal Hal in Millhaven. And so this idea that the disobedience of the law is there for a purpose, and those punishments that occur with that are there for a purpose. The final verse says, give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. It does not restrict only to the government. Anybody that you owe money to, you should give it to them. Clearly, I think we've settled the issue. If you want to argue that you shouldn't pay taxes, I think you're really misinterpreting these verses. You have to pay your taxes. The word revenue can also be translated as customs or duty. The idea is that if you owe a debt, you should pay it. I'm going to give you two examples from Sault Ste. Marie, from two men. There was a man who went bankrupt in Finland, and he moved his young family to Canada, and he worked very hard, and his kids were very successful. I worked for his son in a business for a while, and he started, as he had money, sending back money back to Finland to pay all the people that he didn't pay when he went bankrupt. So he had no legal obligation to pay those people, but over the years, over many, many years, he paid back every cent that he owed to the people when he went bankrupt. And I had a great deal of respect for that man because he believed that I owed a debt, and even though legally I could get out of it, I need to pay it. There's another guy I knew that he worked very hard. He became a multimillionaire in the Sault Ste. Marie. But he used the courts all the time, and if a business wasn't doing very well, he would isolate that business and he would bankrupt it. And he would stick people with all sorts of bills. Hundreds of people in Sault Ste. Marie didn't get paid because of this man. He kept his home, he kept his savings, he kept his other businesses because he knew the law and he knew how to get around all of those things. He was always trying to find ways to not pay his debts, and even in very simple ways. So a friend of mine sold him, he had a hotel in the Soo, the Water Tower Inn, and so he wanted some bales in the fall to do a kind of a fall thing, and so he sold him $100 worth of small square bales, rectangular bales, and delivers the bales, he gets $50. Where's the other 50? The guy said, well, sue me if you want the other 50. I'm only paying you $50 for these bales. It was such an inconsequential thing and such a small amount of money to the owner of this establishment, but really left a bad taste with my friend who said, like, it's $100. Like, we made a deal, and now you're saying I got to take you to court to get what I'm owed? That doesn't make any sense at all. I don't have any respect for that man. I think the verse is clear. If you owe somebody money, pay them what you owe. It says then to give respect to those who have respect. The Greek word here is phobos, or translated as fear. And we think of fearing God. We often think of reverential fear. I struggle with this word in the Bible because it talks about fearing God, it talks about fearing people here, and we often think of this in a negative sense. So I kind of struggle with this verse a little bit. Jim Bakker, who you might know, the televangelist, there's a whole bunch of scandals. He got convicted and he got put in jail. And a Christian news reporter went to visit him, and he said, "Jim, when did you stop loving Jesus?" And Jim said, "Well, I never stopped loving Jesus. I dearly love Jesus to this day." He said, "But I stopped fearing God. That's what got me in trouble." And so I think this idea of having this reverential fear for people in authority is a good thing. Do we fear people that are put in authority over us? Do we treat Carney and Ford with reverential respect? Not sure we do. But these verses are pretty clear. They were installed by God and should be treated as such. We use the same word. It says when it says to, honor your father and mother. It's the same word there. This is my only Mother's Day story in here, and I put it in just because it's Mother's Day. Many of you would have heard me say that my mother was a terrible cook. She was a terrible cook growing up. And I know you've heard me say that, and I bet you some of you are thinking in your minds, that's not very respectful to your mother. Well, my mother had a good sense of humor, and she would tell you she was a terrible cook growing up. And my mom had a phobia, a great fear of traveling. And she lived in a small town in Northern Ontario, and she hated leaving. And so in the 25 years that we were down here when she was alive, it took a pretty special event to get her down here. She would come for one of my kids' weddings, but for no other purpose. So that's 2 times in 25 years, 3 times maybe she came down. But out of respect for her, 4 or 5 times a year, I'd pile my kids in the car and I would make that 600-kilometer drive up to Northern Ontario to visit her. And the last 2 or 3 years of her life, every month, I would go for 3 or 4 days up to visit her, because that's the respect my mother deserved. And I have a great deal of respect for my mother, and I just thought, I understand you're not going to come and visit me, but if I love you and respect you, I need to go and make sure that you see me a lot. It says, if honor, then honor. In the Greek, there are 2 meanings to this word. The first says, if something has a price, then value that price. Basically saying, if you agree to pay $100 for bales of hay, then pay the $100, don't pay $50. The other one says, if someone in a certain rank or position of authority over a certain office, they need to be honored because of that position, even though they might not be someone who you might think is worthy of that position. I've struggled with this. I worked with a guy for 13 years, and we got along really well. And he brought me in the office one day, and he says, I'm headed to Montreal. I'm going to be a vice president. I said, do you know who's taking over your position? Who's going to be my new boss? And he said, no, I don't. And so a couple days later, I get on the phone, I call some of my friends in Montreal, and I said, hey, who's on the list? Who's on the list to take over Ontario? And they gave me a list of names. And one of the guys on the list, I thought, man, that guy is just the wrong person. His personal life is a mess. He's got a huge ego. I cannot work for this guy. Like anybody else on that list but him. We can't have this guy become the boss of Ontario. Of course, you know who became the boss of Ontario. And I remember when the news came out thinking, I don't know how I'm going to deal with it. Like, this guy is just so arrogant and so rude to people, and he wouldn't allow people to use his first name. So if you addressed him, you had to say Mr. and his last name. And I thought, that's not going to go over well with people at all. Like, it's a welding company. It's not that, used to protocols like that. But he insisted you had to call him by his Mr. and his last name. And I remember thinking, how do I deal with this? And this, some of those passages about like this came to my mind, and I thought, I have to treat him like the general manager of Ontario, not like the individual I know. And I just purposed in my heart, I need to suck it up, and I need to treat him with respect and treat him with dignity, and hopefully things are going to work out. And he was there for a couple of years, and we never became best friends. But I remember when he came to tell me he was leaving and he was going out west, and he gave me a hug, and there were tears in his eyes. And I thought, that's the way it should work. I honored him even though I didn't want to. I respected him even though I didn't want to. And it had an impact on his life. This passage does not give us a lot of options. There's a lot of things in here that we probably don't want to do. And it commands us to do certain things that are not natural for us to do. But just in conclusion, it says, treat our politicians with dignity and respect. Treating people in authority with dignity and respect. I point the finger at myself on this one more than anybody else. I realize how disrespectful I can be in talking about some politicians and people in authority. It says, pay your bills on time. Pay what you owe, pay it on time. Pay our taxes. You owe taxes, pay taxes. Obey the laws, even the ones we don't like, that say we can't go faster than the speed limit. We're to obey the laws the government has put before us. So I hope it makes you think like it did me when I was working on this sermon. And more importantly, I hope it makes you do, that you go and you do something with the message that God has for you here today. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you again. God, we are incredibly blessed, and we have so many freedoms in Canada, and one of them is the freedom to be very disrespectful to our politicians and to people in authority. And yet, God, we're told here that we are to honor them and we are to treat them with respect. And Father, we just pray that we would be good witnesses and good testimonies. Father, I know how I felt when I got pulled over speeding on the way to church. And I just did not want him to ask me where I was going, because I knew that that was a bad testimony. And Father, that you would encourage each one of us, that you would lift each one up, that you would allow us to be light and salt in this earth, that we would be able to present you, to present your Son in a way that is positive, and Father, that I would allow other people to be drawn towards him. And so, Father, as we go today, we just pray a blessing upon the people here and the people who listen to this, and that we'll be encouraged by it. And we pray in your Son's name. Amen.